She pretended to be broke and homeless in a town where nobody knew her name. She had no idea the mechanic who bought her coffee that day.
Claire Donnelly had $11 million in a trust fund and not one person in her life she could trust. That was the thought that kept circling back to her on the night she decided to disappear. Not die, not run away for good, just vanish long enough to find out if a single human being on this earth could look at her with nothing to gain and still choose to stay. She was 34 years old, the only daughter of a man who had built a shipping empire out of a single rusted barge on the Ohio River, and every relationship she'd had since college had ended the same way. A man would court her. A man would tell her she was different from other women. A man would eventually, always, ask a question that circled back to the money. She had grown so used to hearing the word "we" followed by a business proposal that she'd stopped being able to tell affection from appetite. So she made a decision that her therapist would later call reckless and her father would call insane. She packed one duffel bag with 3 days of plain clothes, left her phone, her credit cards, and her name behind in a safety deposit box, and drove herself to a small town outside Asheville, North Carolina, where nobody had ever heard of Donnelly Maritime. She told herself she'd give it 30 days. She told herself if nothing came of it, she'd go home, marry whichever suitable man her father had lined up next, and stop wasting time chasing something that might not exist. She did not tell herself what she'd do if it worked, because some part of her never believed it would. Her mother had died when Claire was 19, and in the years since, Claire had watched her father harden into a man who measured people by what they could contribute to a balance sheet, a habit he'd picked up out of grief more than greed, though the two had become impossible to separate by the time Claire was old enough to notice. She'd grown up in a house with 11 bedrooms and had never once brought a friend home without her father quietly running a background check first. By the time she was old enough to date, she understood, without anyone saying it directly, that every man who walked through the front door had already been evaluated for his net worth before he'd finished shaking her father's hand. She used to think that was protection. Somewhere around her 30th birthday, she started to wonder if it was actually a cage built out of good intentions. The town was called Milbrook, the kind of place with one traffic light and a diner that had been serving the same meatloaf special since 1974. Claire arrived with $40 in cash she hadn't spent yet, a story about a car that had broken down 2 counties back, and a face that hadn't slept properly in 3 days because sleeping in a car turned out to be nothing like the movies made it look. She found the diner first. She found Daniel Cole second, and she would later say that finding him felt less like meeting a stranger and more like walking into a room she'd been circling her whole life without knowing the door was there. Daniel was 38, ran the auto shop 2 doors down from the diner, and had a habit of tipping the waitress even when he could barely afford his own lunch. He noticed Claire because she was sitting in the corner booth nursing a single cup of coffee for over an hour, the universal signal of someone counting every dollar they had left. He didn't say anything to her that first day. He just quietly told the waitress, Marlene, to put his ticket on Claire's tab, and to make sure Claire didn't see him do it. Marlene, who had known Daniel since he was in diapers, rolled her eyes and did it anyway, because that was who Daniel had always been. If you've ever wondered whether kindness is something people perform for an audience or something they carry when no one's watching, you're about to find out exactly what kind of man Daniel Cole was, because everything that happened next unfolded in front of an audience of one person who was lying about her name. Claire found out about the coffee 2 days later, when Marlene let it slip without thinking. She confronted Daniel outside his shop, half grateful and half furious, the way people get when someone does something generous and it makes them feel exposed. Daniel just shrugged and said everybody needed a hand sometimes, and it wasn't a big deal. And did she need work? Because his shop's front office could use someone to answer phones, and he was tired of doing it himself with grease on his hands. Claire almost laughed at the absurdity of it. An heiress to a $300 million company being offered $9 an hour to answer a phone in a garage. She said yes before she'd even finished thinking about it. The work was nothing like anything she'd done before, and that was exactly the point. She answered calls, scheduled oil changes, learned the names of regular customers, and watched Daniel work with his hands in a way that struck her as almost meditative. He didn't perform generosity. He didn't announce it. When old Mr. Petrosky couldn't afford his break job, Daniel quietly adjusted the invoice and never mentioned it again. When a single mother named Renata came in with a check engine light and a toddler on her hip, Daniel fixed the sensor for the cost of the part alone and told her the labor was on the house because her ex-husband's truck, the one he used to service for free, had left her with enough headaches already. Claire started renting a room above the hardware store from a widow named Peggy and, paying with the money she earned answering phones, sleeping on a mattress that dipped in the middle, and for the first time in her adult life, she felt like she understood what her father's money had actually cost her. Not comfort. Comfort she'd always had. It had cost her the ability to know, with any certainty, whether anyone around her liked her or liked what she represented. The lie sat heavier on Claire than she expected. She had assumed, driving into Milbrook that first night, that pretending to be someone else would feel like relief, like setting down a weight she'd been carrying since childhood. Instead, every time Daniel asked an ordinary question about her family, or her hometown, or why a woman with her vocabulary and her posture had never gone to college, Claire felt the lie tighten around her chest a little further. She started rehearsing answers in the mirror above Peggy Ann's dresser, the way a person rehearses for a performance they never wanted a part in. More than once, she almost told him everything, and more than once, she talked herself out of it, terrified that the moment he learned the truth, he'd start looking at her the way every other man had, like a woman-shaped invoice waiting to be collected. Weeks passed. Daniel started walking her home after closing, not because she'd asked, but because Milbrook streets went dark early, and he said it wasn't right for a woman to walk alone, even in a town where nothing bad had happened since the Clinton administration. They talked about everything except the things that mattered most. She never told him where she came from. He never asked too hard, sensing, the way careful people sometimes do, that pressing on a bruise before someone was ready would only make them pull away. One night in October, sitting on the tailgate of his truck outside the shop, Daniel told her about his ex-wife, a woman named Bethany who had left him 6 years earlier for a man who sold insurance and drove a car that didn't smell like motor oil. He said it without bitterness, which surprised Claire more than the story itself. He said he used to think love was about being enough for somebody, and then he learned the hard way that some people's version of enough had a dollar sign attached to it whether they admitted it to themselves or not. Claire sat very still when he said that. She thought about $11 million sitting untouched in a trust fund 300 miles away, and she thought about how close she'd come to becoming exactly the kind of person Daniel had just described, not because she was greedy, but because she'd let money decide who got close enough to hurt her. Claire started noticing small things about herself changing, things that had nothing to do with Daniel directly. She stopped flinching when a customer at the shop mentioned money troubles, because for the first time in her life, she genuinely understood what it meant to count out exact change for a tank of gas. She learned to change her own oil, badly at first, then competently, and felt a strange pride in the grease under her fingernails that no amount of jewelry had ever given her. Peggy Ann taught her how to can tomatoes in the fall, and Claire found herself staying up past midnight labeling mason jars, thinking about how strange it was that this, standing in a stranger's kitchen with her hands smelling like vinegar, felt more like home than any room in her father's 11-bedroom house ever had. By December, something had shifted between them that neither one wanted to name out loud. Daniel started bringing 2 coffees to the shop instead of 1, without being asked. Claire started staying late after closing, not because there was more work, but because the quiet of the empty garage with him in it felt like the first honest quiet she'd had in years. Neither of them called it dating. Both of them knew exactly what it was. It was Daniel who kissed her first, on a night when the shop's heater had broken and they were both wearing coats indoors, laughing about how a man who fixed engines for a living couldn't keep his own building warm. He kissed her like a question, not a claim, and when she kissed him back, she felt something crack open in her chest that she hadn't realized had been sealed shut for a decade. For the first time since she'd driven into Milbrook with $40 and a fake story, Claire allowed herself to imagine a version of her life that didn't involve the Donnelly name at all. There was one close call before Preston ever arrived. A moment in January when a traveling insurance adjuster came through Milbrook to settle a claim on a fender bender and recognized Claire from a charity gala photograph that had run in a regional business magazine 2 years earlier. He said her name, her real name, right there at the counter in front of Daniel, and for 3 full seconds Claire's entire fabricated life balanced on a blade's edge. She laughed it off, told the adjuster he had her confused with somebody else, said she got that a lot, and the man shrugged and let it go, distracted by the claim paperwork in his hand. Daniel didn't press her about it. But that night, walking her home, he asked, almost gently, whether there was anything about her past she thought he deserved to know, and Claire told him not yet, and he told her he could wait, because he'd rather have the truth late than a lie on time. But the past does not stay buried simply because you want it to, and Claire's past had a name, and that name was Preston Wexler. Preston had been circling Claire for almost 2 years before she disappeared, the son of a man who did business with her father, a smile built for boardrooms and photographs, and an engagement ring he'd bought before she'd ever agreed to marry him, as if the proposal itself was a formality standing between him and a merger he'd already decided was finalized. When Claire vanished, Preston did not grieve. He hired a private investigator, because losing access to $11 million was not a heartbreak he intended to sit with quietly. It took the investigator 4 months to trace a rental car, a gas station camera, and a diner receipt back to a town called Milbrook. Preston did not come alone. He came with the investigator's file, a photograph of Claire in an evening gown from a charity gala 18 months earlier, and a plan that had nothing to do with love and everything to do with making sure the woman attached to his family's next business deal came home before the deal fell apart. He found her on a Saturday afternoon in February, standing outside the auto shop in a flannel jacket that had belonged to Daniel, laughing at something one of the mechanics had said. Preston stepped out of a car that cost more than every building on Main Street combined, and the entire town seemed to hold its breath at once. Claire. He said her name like a correction, like she'd misspelled something and he was here to fix it. Your father has had people looking for you for months. Do you have any idea what you've put everyone through? Daniel came out from under a truck at the sound of a stranger's voice, wiping his hands on a rag, and Claire watched something in his face shift as Preston kept talking, laying out details that made no sense to a mechanic in North Carolina. Trust funds, boardrooms, a family shipping company, a name, Donnelly, that Preston said like it should mean something, and the way Claire's silence stretched out told Daniel, before a single word of explanation came, that it meant everything. If you've stuck with this story so far, you already know the hardest part isn't the lie itself. It's the look on someone's face in the half second after they realize they've been living inside one. And what Daniel Cole did next says more about him than anything that came before it. Daniel didn't yell. He didn't throw anything, didn't storm off, didn't give Preston the satisfaction of a scene. He just looked at Claire, really looked at her, the way you look at someone when you're trying to decide how many of your memories with them are still true. Is any of it real? He asked, quiet enough that Preston had to lean in to hear it. The name doesn't matter to me. I need to know if any of it was real. Claire's chest ached in a way she hadn't experienced since her mother's funeral 15 years earlier. She looked at Preston, at his 4-month manhunt and his merger disguised as concern, and then she looked at Daniel, at 6 months of quiet coffee and quiet kindness and a kiss that had felt like a question. All of it, she said. Every single day of it was real. The only thing that wasn't real was my name. For a moment, nobody moved. The only sound in the lot was a compressor hissing inside the shop and the distant clang of a wrench someone had set down mid-task. Forgotten the second Preston's car door opened. Marlene had stepped out of the diner across the street, drawn by the sight of a car that expensive parked outside a garage, and stood frozen on the curb with a coffee pot still in her hand. Even the mechanics who barely knew Claire's real story sensed that whatever was unfolding mattered, the way a town instinctively quiets when it senses a turning point happening in front of it. Preston, sensing the conversation slipping away from the script he'd rehearsed on the drive down, made the mistake every entitled man in his position eventually makes. He reached for Claire's arm, the way a man reaches for something he still believes belongs to him, and said her father was expecting them both in Cincinnati by Monday for the announcement dinner, the one where the Donnelly-Wexler partnership would be made official in front of 200 shareholders. Daniel stepped between them before Claire had to. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. 6 years of running his own shop had taught him that the men who talked the loudest were rarely the ones you needed to worry about. She said no, Daniel told him. I don't know what kind of dinner you're talking about, and I don't much care, but I know what a woman's face looks like when she wants to leave a room, and hers has looked like that since you got out of that car. Preston laughed, the kind of laugh men use when they've run out of leverage and haven't noticed yet. He told Daniel he had no idea what he was interfering with, that Claire's father had built an empire that men like Daniel would spend 3 lifetimes failing to understand, and that in 6 months Daniel would be a story Claire told at dinner parties, the quaint mechanic she'd slummed it with during her little rebellion. What Preston didn't know, what he'd never bothered to find out in 2 years of courting Claire for her name, was that Claire had spent the last 6 months learning exactly what she was worth without the Donnelly name attached to it. And the answer had turned out to be considerably more than what Preston had ever offered her. She took off the flannel jacket, folded it once, and handed it back to Daniel, not as a goodbye, but so her hands would be free for what came next. Preston, she said, and her voice had the particular calm of a woman who has finally stopped performing for other people's expectations. I've watched you for 2 years pretend that wanting my father's shipping contracts and wanting me were the same thing. You never noticed the difference, and honestly, I don't think you ever will. I'm not coming to Cincinnati. I'm not marrying you. And you can tell my father that if he wants to see his daughter again, he can come to Milbrook himself, without a photographer, and without a merger attached to the invitation. Preston's composure cracked for the first time since he'd stepped out of the car. He told her she was throwing away everything her family had built, that a man like Daniel could never give her the life she was born into. Claire looked at Daniel, at grease under his fingernails and a shop that fixed cars for people who couldn't otherwise afford to get to work, and told Preston that she'd spent 34 years surrounded by everything her family had built and had never once, not a single time, felt as safe as she'd felt in the 6 months since she'd lost it all. A small crowd had gathered by then, the way small towns do when something out of the ordinary interrupts a Saturday afternoon. Mechanics and diner regulars and Peggy, and from the hardware store, all of them watching a stranger in an expensive coat lose an argument he hadn't realized he was already losing. Preston looked around at their faces, at people who clearly thought less of him with every sentence he spoke, and made one final attempt, offering Daniel a check on the spot, a number with more zeros than Daniel's shop made in 3 years combined, if he'd simply step aside and let Claire come home where she belonged. Daniel didn't even look at the check. He looked at Claire instead and told Preston that some things weren't for sale, and if Preston had spent as much time getting to know Claire as he'd spent tracking her down, he'd have already known that about her too. Preston left Milbrook that same afternoon, though not before making one last call from the parking lot outside the diner, a call Claire would only learn about later, to her father, twisting the story into something about a small-town con man who'd manipulated a vulnerable, wealthy woman into handing over her trust. It was a petty, desperate move, the kind men make when they realize losing gracefully was never a skill they'd bothered to develop. 2 days later, A car far more modest than Preston's pulled up outside the shop. Claire's father, Marcus Donnelly, stepped out alone, 71 years old, wearing a coat too heavy for the mild February afternoon, looking exactly as tired as a man looks when he spent 4 months not knowing if his daughter was alive. He didn't ask about mergers. He didn't ask about the company. He looked at Claire standing in a garage that smelled like motor oil and asked her only one question: "Are you happy?" Claire told her father everything. The $40, the diner booth, the coffee Daniel paid for without telling her, the flannel jacket, the 6 months of not knowing whether anyone could ever look at her and see a person instead of a portfolio. Marcus Donnelly listened the way he hadn't listened to his daughter in years, and when she finished, he did something that surprised everyone in the room, including himself. He walked over to Daniel, extended a hand still calloused from decades of working the docks himself before the company grew large enough that he no longer had to, and thanked him. Not for anything specific, not for saving Claire or loving her, or any of the things a lesser man might have said to sound gracious for an audience. He thanked him simply for being decent to a stranger with nothing to offer, on days when nobody was watching to reward him for it, and said that in 71 years and a company worth $300 million, he'd met very few men who could say the same. Marcus stayed in Milbrook for the better part of a week that February, longer than anyone expected, sleeping in the town's only bed and breakfast, and showing up at the shop every morning with 2 coffees, one for himself and one for Daniel. The same quiet gesture Daniel had once offered his daughter without asking for anything back. He watched his daughter work the front desk, watched customers greet her by name instead of by reputation, watched Daniel treat her like a partner instead of a prize, and by the end of the week he'd stopped asking when she was coming home, because he'd finally understood that she already was. Preston Wexler's business relationship with Donnelly Maritime dissolved within the month, not out of spite, but because Marcus Donnelly quietly discovered, through the kind of investigation only real money can afford, that Preston had been skimming margin off 3 separate shipping contracts for the better part of 2 years, banking on the marriage to make the numbers disappear before an audit ever caught up to him. The partnership Preston had been so desperate to seal collapsed not because of a mechanic in North Carolina, but because the man chasing Claire's fortune had been quietly stealing from her family the entire time he claimed to love her. Karma, it turned out, didn't need Claire's help at all. It simply waited until Preston stopped watching his own back long enough to notice. The last anyone in Milbrook heard of Preston Wexler, he'd taken a position at a smaller firm 2 states away, the kind of lateral move people make when they're hoping nobody checks their references too closely. He never contacted Claire again, and she never wasted a thought wondering why. Some men only know how to chase a thing until it's caught, and have no idea what to do with it once it stops running. Claire never went back to being who she was before Milbrook, not entirely. She kept the trust fund, because walking away from 34 years of family history to prove a point felt less like integrity and more like performance, but she used it differently than anyone in her family ever had. She and Daniel expanded the shop within the year, not into some glossy franchise, but into a second bay that let them hire 2 more mechanics and offer a standing discount to anyone in Milbrook who couldn't otherwise afford the repair, a policy Daniel had been running out of his own pocket for years before Claire had the means to make it official and sustainable. They married the following autumn in the parking lot of the shop, string lights hung between the bay doors, Marlene the waitress crying into a napkin in the front row, and Marcus Donnelly walking his daughter down an aisle made of cracked pavement instead of marble, looking prouder than he had at any gala the family had ever thrown. He gave a short toast at the reception, held together with folding tables and a borrowed sound system, and told the room that he'd spent 40 years building a company on the theory that everything worth having could be measured, and that it had taken his daughter running away to a town he'd never heard of to teach him he'd been wrong the entire time. Daniel's mother, who had raised him alone after his father left when he was 9, stood near the back of the crowd that night with tears in her eyes. telling anyone who'd listened that she'd always known her son would end up with someone who saw him clearly. She just never imagined that someone would come from a family with its own airplane. Renata, the single mother whose check engine light Daniel had once fixed for free, brought her daughter to the wedding in a dress Claire had quietly paid for without telling anyone, because by then Claire had learned that generosity, done right, didn't need an audience any more than Daniel's had. Even Mr. Petrosky showed up, leaning on his cane, telling anyone within earshot that he'd known Daniel was headed for something good the moment he watched him hand a stranger a free cup of coffee without expecting a thing in return. If there's one thing worth sitting with after a story like this, it's the question of what we actually mean when we say we want someone to love us for who we are. Claire Donnelly had to lose everything that made her valuable on paper before she found out what she was worth to a man who had no idea what paper she came from. Daniel Cole never once asked her for anything, not her name, not her money, not an explanation, and that was exactly why he ended up with all three. Preston Wexler had every advantage money could buy and lost everything the moment his greed outran his patience. And somewhere in a small town outside Asheville, a woman worth $11 million still spends her Saturday mornings answering phones in a garage that smells like motor oil, because she finally found the one thing her family's fortune could never purchase for her, a man who loved her before he ever knew there was a fortune at all. These days, Claire keeps a photograph on the shop's front counter, not of any gala or family portrait, but of the corner booth at the diner where she sat with a single cup of coffee, counting dollars she no longer needed to count. Customers ask about it sometimes, and Daniel always answers before Claire can, telling them that's where his wife taught him something he never learned anywhere else, that the people worth keeping in your life are rarely the ones who show up when you have everything to offer. They're the ones who stay when you have nothing at all. If this story meant something to you, stay close, because there are more like it coming, stories about people who lost everything they thought defined them and found out, the hard way, what was real all along.